It's Sunday, August 17th, and Hurricane Erin is undergoing a major change. And that major change is going to be an eye wall replacement cycle. We can really start to see that eye structure really start to deform and collapse. And what we're about to see is that Erin is going to temporarily really start to weaken. And actually, it already has done that. Currently, it is a Category 4 storm, still a strong Category 4 storm, but that is nothing compared to what it was earlier in the day. Earlier in the day, it became the 19th most intense Atlantic hurricane on record, reaching a low of 915 millibars and a peak of 160 mile an hour sustained winds. But also another thing about this eye wall replacement cycle is that this is a very critical period because during this time, we're really going to find out how this will affect the track, how it will re-strengthen, and how re-strengthening it will affect its track. And most of all, we'll also find out if this storm will be able to re-strengthen above what it already peaked at before. But some good news with Erin is actually that the track is looking extremely likely to thread the needle between the coast of North Carolina and Bermuda, which would of course be the best case scenario. Really seeing something that would be other than that currently at this moment is looking very unlikely, but still, if you're in both those areas, still stay weather aware and watch this very closely. But it looks like it's just going to be a very strong storm passing through that corridor and not really making any impacts to land other than some very high waves and rip currents. And further supporting that are our European ensembles. We can really see them start to zero in on this storm going through that corridor. And we've also started to see a lot of model agreement on the same thing. This is really the first day where a lot of our models have been very tightly knit. And even our hurricane models, which have the most reliable updates on the intensity on this storm and how that will affect the track, even see it going down this same path. And as for the ingredients in front of Erin, here are our sea surface temperatures. Erin is going to be right about here, just about north of Puerto Rico, and it's still going to be expected to take that turn and thread the needle between Bermuda and the US. Now, something we will see it go through is this increased area of sea surface temperatures right about due east of the Bahamas and Orlando, Florida. And this is an area where we could actually see potentially some re-intensification occur. And on top of the sea surface temperatures, which are not going to be a problem, it appears that Erin is going to be in an environment where moisture will not be an issue at all. And as we go through the future, we can really see that the moisture is going to pretty much stay pretty tightly knit to the center and that the dry air and dust will not really affect Erin. But it appears that the main hindrance could actually be an area of increased wind shear. As we go into the future, it appears that it would still be in a pretty favorable corridor of wind shear for development and re-intensification all the way up until it reaches Wednesday afternoon. So there's definitely still a lot of time to see something like that occur. But it looks like in the future, this would be the main thing which would start to break apart our storm. And on top of Hurricane Erin, we could potentially see some widespread severe weather across the United States today. We have a marginal risk in the Northeast and also in the upper northern plains and quite a bit of the central plains today. And this would mostly be fueled by the threat of some 60 mile an hour damaging gusts in both of our marginal risk areas. And then for our hail risk, it's going to be pretty uniquely shaped, and it's also only going to be out here in our Great Plains risk area today. And this would be for the conditional threat of some 1 to 1.5 inch in diameter hail in this area. And then lastly, there's also going to be a small risk of some weak spin up tornadoes in southwestern Minnesota today as well. And then that storm cluster in southern Minnesota could actually bring a pretty decent flooding threat today, with an area receiving around 2 to 4 inches of rain in that slight risk area, then a marginal risk area which spans quite a bit more of the northern west and northern plains. We could see 1 to 2 inches of rain in that risk area, and the same would go for the rest of our marginal risk areas. One out here in the northeast, another one spanning pretty much all of Florida, then another one down here in the desert southwest and Texas panhandle. So just something to stay weather aware of if you're in any of those areas. And then our really strong heat dome is actually continuing to grow in strength. We're going to see a lot of low to mid hundreds in our Florida, lower Mississippi River Valley, and even up into the Midwest and also eastern Texas region today. Also, specifically in eastern Texas and the lower Mississippi River Valley, and even up towards the Missouri River is an area where we could see some high hundreds feels like temperatures as well. And then for the rest of the Great Plains and pretty much anywhere east of the Appalachians, we could see some high to mid 90s feels like temperatures as well today. And here's what the radar could look like today. And we are actually going to see that our first area of storm development is going to be in that southern Minnesota risk area, potentially posing a risk for all threats of severe weather. And this is actually going to be some redevelopment from yesterday's storms with a low pressure system and a front end, potentially even a bit of a warm front draped across southern Minnesota today. So more further to the northern part of this line of thunderstorms, which is expected to develop, would be where that tornado threat would be greatest. So that's also something to look out there. Also with the potential of some small hail and some 60-mile-an-hour damaging gusts. That would likely come around the early afternoon and last all the way through until nightfall. Now, our other clusters of storms are going to initiate all the way up here, pretty much from the upper plains in Minnesota and all the way down into northern Nebraska. Now, in Minnesota, these storms are mostly just going to be some high-based small wind inhalers, potentially bringing that severe threat. And then these would be initiated by some convergence brought by some synoptic flow. And then also these would be around the late afternoon hours. And then in northern Nebraska, we could actually see a pretty decent area of some severe weather develop, specifically a mesoscale convective system form. And this would be with a low pressure system, a cold front, and even potentially a bit of a warm front draped over this as well, with the addition of some synoptic forcing going on. And this would mostly be a line bringing that threat or some damaging winds and small hail. The damaging wind risk could actually be up to potentially 70 miles an hour with this storm, and this would actually be initiated around the evening hours with the hope of the low-level jet and wouldn't last super long, likely falling apart a couple hours after that and just becoming a rainmaker. And then in the northeast, along a front and some synoptic forcing, we could also see some severe storms today. This would pretty much be all the way down from around the Washington, D.C. area all the way up into the U.S.-Canada border in Maine. And although this model isn't really showing a bunch right now, I definitely do think we can expect to see a couple of severe storms out here, mostly bringing that threat of some damaging winds. Then here are 500 millibar winds showing us where that large-scale synoptic forcing is going to be, and we can see that trough in our northeast, which is going to be expected to bring a couple of severe storms, also some organizing shear. And we're also going to look back in our Central Plains risk area and also Northern Midwest risk area. We're going to see a bit of a shortwave pushing through that Minnesota area around midday in the early afternoon, which is going to be a partial cause for storms out here. And then we'll also see some just general northwesterly flow pretty much out here across the plains, which is expected to help initiate and organize a couple of those storm clusters as we go later into the day, with specifically a shortwave actually ejecting over our northern Midwestern risk area. Then we'll also see that heat dome or high pressure system really digging in across the central US, bringing some of those very hot temperatures and also just a general ridge, which can also tend to bring some more organizing shear to some of our storm clusters today. Then we'll actually see Hurricane Erin showing up in the 500 millibar winds, which is definitely something interesting to see. And it's just a reminder of how powerful and large this storm actually is. And here's the storm environment in that southern Minnesota risk area, potentially bringing the risk of all hazards of severe weather, that being some small hail, some damaging winds, and also potentially the threat of a couple of weak spin-up tornadoes. And we can see that our shear and helicity is actually going to be extremely favorable for a lot of spin-up tornadoes along that line of thunderstorms. And also our bulk shear is going to be around 30 knots. So definitely in very organized cluster. Then also we have some wind veering, which is going to help to organize that cluster a tad bit more. Now the main thing is that it's going to be a very moist environment, 77 dew point, and a very unstable dew environment, 4,500 CAPE. Then also our 3 CAPE is going to be quite high, also increasing that tornado threat a bit, and also that general threat for severe weather at around 150. So just very favorable for severe weather in those facets. Now, something that could hinder more tornado threat a little and just general severe threat altogether would be a bit of stable air near the surface. And this would really rely on how fast that the environment could recover. But even despite this, I do think there would still be the decent risk for seeing all hazards of severe weather out here in that risk area today. Now for hail, we do have some CAPE up here near our freezing level, and we do have a decent mid-level lapse rate. But because this storm mode is going to be expected to be linear, it's really only going to be for some 1.5 inch hail. And then for our damaging wind risk, we see that our precipitable water is very high, 2.2 inches, which can bring some stronger downdrafts. And another thing is specifically a pretty high flooding risk, which we're also expecting to unfold out here today. And here's a look in our northern Nebraska or just general plains risk area, potentially bringing that threat for some small to decently sized hail and damaging us potentially in that 60 to 70 mile an hour range. Now, immediately we're going to notice that our bulk shear is going to be somewhat good at around 30 knots as well. So definitely some organized storm clusters out here. And another thing is that our cloud bases are going to be quite a bit higher, which actually increases our threat of damaging winds, but pretty much eliminates that threat of seeing any tornadoes out here altogether. We do see a fairly moist environment for this area and also a somewhat unstable environment around 3,000 Cape. So just favorable for severe weather in general. For our damaging wind threat, we do see some dry air aloft, although it's not mixed in super great, but that won't really matter because our downdraft Cape is still quite high, 1,500, and our relative humidity is somewhat low. So definitely something that could bring that 60 to 70 mile an hour risk for some damaging winds. And then the last thing is that for our hail risk, we do have quite a bit of Cape up here near our freezing level. Then our mid-level lapse rates are also 8.5 Celsius, decreasing per kilometer. So potentially some 1 to 2 inch in diameter hail out here in the plains today. And the last storm environment for today is going to be in the northeast. This mostly looks like it's just going to be for some damaging winds. We do see that classic inverted V profile and also pretty moist environment, 70 dew point in a pretty unstable environment, 2,500 Cape, then also some very high low-level lapse rates. And our cloud base would actually be low enough and our 3 Cape is high enough that I wouldn't say the tornado threat is completely zero, but because our shear is going to be pretty much non-existent, it's going to be pretty close to it, but just things that are going to be generally favorable for severe weather today, mostly a damaging wind risk.